always want to be, anytime the creek channel is making a bend, I want my boat to be positioned on the inside of the bend. And that's because even though they can be on the inside or the outside and they can kind of be all over it right now this time of year, your highest percentage spot in any creek channel bend, even a soft subtle bend, your highest percentage spot is going to be that outside bend. That's where, if the stumps are on the edge of the channel, that's where the root systems will be the most exposed from the old washout back in the day. That's where you are going to have the most significant change in depth. And a big dominant fish is a big dominant fish. And he's going to want to be around the most dominant piece of structure and cover that he can. And your odds of running into that are better on the outside of the bend. So every time the creek makes a bend, I move my boat a little bit to the inside. And I'll just go down that creek and I'll just pitch at stumps. And I'll hit every piece of visible target. And even if I can't see stumps, I'll just visualize where that creek channel edge is. I'll throw a little bit outside of it and drag it down until it falls off. And that's kind of how I fish a creek channel as I'm moving. Then when I hit that inside bend, I'll make longer casts across and I'll slow down on those bends. I'll move a little faster in the straightaways. When it makes a bend, I'll come to the inside, throw across, drag off of that outside bend, let it fall down into the creek, fish it all the way across the creek to the inside bend. Because if you think about a creek channel that goes like this, right, and a bend, what's this right here? What is that? That's a point. That's a point. So even though I want to fish this more dominant drop off, this more dominant piece of cover here, I want to fish this point too. So my boat's going to be positioned over here. I'm going to kind of slow down and stop, and I'm going to pick that bend apart a lot more thoroughly than I am the straightaways. So the straightaways, I'm kind of fishing at a 45 at an angle, covering the water. When I get to the bends, I'll stop, fish it a little more thorough, and just pick up and keep moving. Keep moving. It's not the fastest way to cover water, but man, if you've got a creek that you know there's been some good fish in the back of, and you start getting in that, I'm telling you, if there's been a bunch of fish in the back of a creek, right now, there's going to be a group of fish somewhere in the ditch or the drain of the channel that's out in the middle. There will be a group of fish starting to gather in there somewhere in that area. And then when you find a bite, stop. Put the power poles down, hit the spot lock it up. When you get a bite, lock it up and pick everything apart in that area, because they are not alone right now. They are not alone right now. I don't think we caught any single fish today. Every spot we caught a fish, we caught another fish. And then another one and another one and another one.
We had 4 doubles.
We did have 4 double ups today, like fishing in there, you had 2 on at once. So yeah, they're definitely getting, finally, some of these fish are starting to group. Which is the best thing. That's what you really want. As far as the jigs that I like to use, like I said, right now I use 2 jigs basically. I use a green and brown jig, and I use a black and blue jig. And right now in the earlier part of the year, I'll tend to lean more towards that green and brown, unless it's just a local knowledge thing where I know black and blue work. There's some lakes. That's one of them. Black and blue can always work out here, right? We know that. So I will throw it more out here, but especially in the clearer the water is, the more I'll lean towards green and brown. We've got some pretty clean water in a lot of our lakes right now. And Tawakoni's a muddy lake, but a lot of our lakes have cleaner water this time of year than they do any other time of year. So clearer the water is, the more I'm going to lean towards green and brown. My trailer that I'm going to use a green pumpkin trailer on my green and brown jig. I'm going to use a matching black and blue trailer on my black and blue jig. And the trailer that I'm using is the jig and setup and everything I'm using the 6 Sense Divine hybrid jig. It's a great jig. The head design is great for combining a weedless factor with a hookup ratio. You know, in a jig, it's kind of a give-take. Generally speaking, forever and ever, the better your jig hooks them in the top of the head, the better it hooks the stump. Like, it gets hung up a lot worse. Like, y'all remember the old Arky style jigs? Man, they were great for hooking a fish, but you better have a boatload of them if you're going to go fish some root systems or brush piles. Like, you're going to lose a lot of them. So. And then those little narrow stand-up heads, man, they're great for coming through cover, but how many times on those narrow stand-up heads do you hook one in the corner of the mouth? And you lose a lot of jig fish when you hook them in that soft meat. You just will. And so the way that hybrid jig designed, the head's kind of shaped like this. And so what happens is that jig is always at this angle or this angle when it exits their mouth. Because when a jig exits a fish's mouth, if it has tall sides and a narrow, like if it's long this way and narrow going across the bottom, it's going to turn sideways as it comes out of their mouth and blows their mouth. It's going to start to come sideways, and that's why you get those corner hooks a lot on those jigs. And Arky style is flat on the bottom and top, but not tall at all. That's why Arky jig hooks them so good, because it comes out straight with the hook straight up and down. But it also hooks all the trees. So you got that. But that hybrid jig does a great job of combining that. And somehow with that head design, it also rolls just the right amount to roll through cover a lot. I mean, we fished a lot of stuff with a jig and a Texas rig today, and we didn't lose a single jig, not one. We didn't. Now we hung some up and had to pluck at them to get them off. We never did have to go fetch one though. Even when we hung it up, we were able to kind of pluck the line and get it off and bring it back. We didn't lose a single jig with that 6-inch hybrid jig, so it's a very, very effective jig. Yes, sir.
This jig that you're talking about with this head like that.
Yes, sir.
Similar in shape to the Denny Broward jig. Kind of like a.
I'm not real.
Head,
Yeah, it narrows down to the front, but from the side, it's got a little bit of an angle on the bottom, but it's pretty close to flat, but the top's kind of at an angle like this. It's almost like when you're looking at it from the front, it's almost a triangle with a little bit of a bowed bottom. And it just rolls, but it only rolls a little bit. It doesn't flip all the way over on its side when you're dragging over something. It's really good. I'm not 100% familiar with that. I know I've seen a Denny Broward jig, but I've seen a lot of like grass jigs and stuff. I've seen a lot of different Denny Broward jigs, and I'm not familiar with the exact one you're talking about. I can't see it in my head, so I can't confirm that, give you a real good answer. But that kind of triangular shape like that, a little bit of a rounded triangle, yeah. Well, listen, I'm sure if Denny Broward designed a jig, it's probably right. You know what I'm saying? Like that man, he knows that jig. So, but for a trailer, I'm using the 6-inch stroker crawl, and just so I don't seem like I'm being a pro staff hound, because y'all know I work with 6-inch. Another trailer that's really good is Yamamoto twin tail grub. I'm telling you, there's something about those trailers that have those skinny arms that fold up. They just have the right combination of when the jig's sitting still, it folds up and looks like a crawfish and does this. But when the jig's moving or swimming, it's kicking like a tail. It kind of combines all the things you want. When it's swimming, it looks like a brim. And when it's still, it looks like a crawfish. And it's always keying in on some type of prey instinct to a bass. So I really like that stroker crawl from 6-inch Fishing. It's the best jig trailer I've ever used, in my opinion. It's a little bit thicker and does a little bit better job of imitating a crawfish than the Yamamoto twin tail grub does. But the Yamamoto twin tail grub is a very good jig trailer as well. So, and by the way, if you want to, go order those 6-inch products. Somebody say it for me.
Get 10% off.
Punch in that code, you're late for it, guy. Get a 10% discount on anything you order at 6inchfishing.com. I'm legally obligated to say that. Anyway.
It's plug night.
It is plug night. It is plug night. That's the jig and the trailer that I'm using. One thing I do like to do, guys, anytime I'm fishing a jig, other than offshore structure, if I'm dragging like if I'm fishing it like a football jig, and I'll use the hybrid jig like a football jig in the summertime on offshore structure, I will. When I'm fishing big long points, road beds, humps, fishing an offshore structure jig, summertime, what we normally use a football jig for, I'll leave a full skirt and a full size trailer, and I want a big bulky thing that moves a lot of water and all that. Other than that, when I'm fishing a jig, I literally trim the skirt to the bend of the hook, and I trim my trailer to where the hook so right here, the bend of the hook comes out right where the appendages start. So on the head of that stroker crawl, the appendages start right where the little eyes are. So I put the bend of that hook, when I'm rigging that trailer on there and I'm looking for the spot for the hook point to come out, I go right between the eyes and right between where the appendage arms begin. And what that is, I trim that skirt right to the bend of that hook, and that makes it compact, and then I get those appendages started right where that skirt ends. So it's all a very nice, compact, tight bait. I don't ever flip a jig in cover like we're talking about tonight that is a full skirted big profile jig. I've caught a lot of big fish on jigs over the years. I've caught some 10+ pounders on jigs, and every one of them has been short and compact. You don't got to throw a lobster sized jig out there to catch a big one. I'm telling you, a lot of having that skirt trimmed actually, I think, draws a bigger bite, because when you trim that skirt, it creates more flare. And to me, the best big fish bite getting aspect of a jig is the flare of that skirt. You know, fish aren't real smart creatures, but their instincts are tuned in, and there is body language and posturing that exists in their world that creates a defensive or aggressive reaction out of them. If a bass comes down and stares at a crawfish in a root system, what's that crawfish going to do? He's going to try to look as big as he can, right? If a bass backs a brim into a corner, he's going to turn around and kind of turn sideways and flare. He's sit here and flare those fins out. He's going to get as big as he can. And when that jig is nice and narrow and it hits the bottom and it goes like that, and that bass is looking at it, that is something that triggers an instinct in a big dominant bass that, no, you ain't gonna flex on me. You know what I mean? Like, when that little boy right there gets to be about 17 and thinks he's bigger than daddy and bows that chest out, you're not gonna put up with that, are you? You're not, and I'm not, and he didn't, and neither is that bass. Nobody's gonna bow up on that 8, 9, 10 bass. Yeah, that 8, 9, 10 pound bass. He ain't gonna let nobody bow up on him in his house. And that's what that jig does. When it hits and it goes like that, it's like flexing on that fish, and it gets a big fish that may not bite anything else. It preys on one of their instincts that they can't help but to defend their territory, be dominant in their territory. And I think that's one of the reasons it is such a good big fish bait. And trimming the skirt creates more of that, because the shorter the skirt is, the more it flares. Longer the skirt is, the more they just kind of lay around. So trimming that skirt's a big deal.
Living rubber or silicone?
I use predominantly silicone for the flipping jigs. Living rubber to me is something that is not a necessity where we are in this region. If I fished colder water temps through more of the year, then yes, I would be more of a living rubber fan. The deal with living rubber is the water can get so cold that silicone will not have that flare. It won't have that action. It'll get stiff. Plastic will do this. That's why the old port trailers were so popular back in the day, because these plastics will tend to stiffen up. It's also one of the reasons I like plastic for trailers. I like plastics with thin appendages because they will work better in the cooler water temps. You know, you get the bigger, bulkier plastic, they'll stiffen up on you the cold when it gets cold enough. But realistically around here, there's some years we never get that cold water temp wise, and most years we don't get that cold for very long. So I do own living rubber jigs. I do own living rubber skirts that I put on my jigs, but it's pretty rare around here that I feel the need to use it. I'm really looking for a living rubber jig when that water temp is getting pretty close to 40 degrees, which is pretty rare around here. Like when I start getting below 45, 42, 41, 43, kind of thinking about if I get to 40 or below, I'm definitely wanting to use a living rubber skirt.
That's when we go duck hunting.
Yes.
Right. But, you know, if you lived in a different region, if I lived at Table Rock Lake, my water temps would be in that 40 degree, 38 degree range, 37, 35 degree range up there a lot more of the year, and the living rubber would be a lot more of a player for me. The living rubber is a very extreme circumstance around here that you need it. But it is much more effective when the water gets that cold, for sure.
It sure flares.
It does flare good. It does flare good. It almost flares too much in the warm water. Have you seen it? So in warm water, that living rubber jig will almost be like it doesn't have that same flow to it that the silicone does in the 65 degree water. It's a little too active. It's like boing. And I do have a bunch of finesse jigs that have living rubber on them. There's a lot of finesse jigs you can't buy without living rubber on them. The companies only make them because finesse jigs are thought of as a super cold, super finesse technique. And I'm like, dog, I want to throw that finesse jig in 75 degree water in September. Y'all need to make me one with a silicone skirt. But yeah, living rubber is something that, and I think a little bit of the living rubber deal is a personal preference. It's one of them deals that you throw a living rubber skirt and you get some bites on it, you're going to want to keep throwing that skirt, and you're going to think that skirt matters. And if it's in your head, it's in your head, and it does matter. You know, so that's part of it too. There's a lot of personal preference stuff in this fishing game, right? A lot of it. So. It is. It really is. I mean, you know, the stuff we were fishing today, I handed these two gentlemen a 10-inch ridge worm, big, long swimming tail worm that I use. And they caught the first couple fish, but I picked up that jig because I know I want to see if I get a bite on a jig. And sure enough, I get a bite on a jig. It's a significantly bigger fish. And then he catches an even bigger one on the worm. So again, in fact, I think yours might have been the biggest of the day. The one I caught later may have been the same size, but they were pretty close.
That second jig fish I have.
But for all the big fish that we got to bite a jig, and he caught a big one on a jig later in the day too. For all the big fish that we got to bite a jig today, maybe the biggest fish was caught on a worm. So, man, there is a lot of personal preference in this game that if you feel good about throwing that 10-inch worm in there, throw that 10-inch worm in there. You know what I mean? But a jig is something that we all need to learn about because it can be a difference maker going forward from this time of year on. So,
How'd y'all do on the whack today?
Never picked it up. I did pick it up.
No, you didn't, did you?
Yeah, we got them going on a chatterbait, so I had both of them throwing a chatterbait, and just so I would, because I was kind of front-ending them for a little bit when they were biting that chatterbait, and I was like, these guys are fishing chatterbait behind me, and I'm like addicted to throwing a chatterbait. Like, you probably won't find, it's not that I'm the greatest chatterbait fisherman, but you'd be hard-pressed to find somebody that's fished a chatterbait more in East Texas over the last 5 years than I have. So I'm pretty proficient with it. And I was up there kind of catching them quick on that chatterbait this morning. I kind of got to feeling a little bad because these guys are behind me and they're paying for this fiasco. And I'm catching some fish in front of them. So I put that down and I picked up a wacky worm, didn't get a bite on it. Of course, I don't throw it with the exuberance that you do. I made a few pitches to some isolated stumps in the shallow flat. I didn't really go after it that hard. I was more trying to let them catch fish at that time.
Yeah. And they were throwing the 10-inch worm?
No, up there they were throwing a chatterbait when I picked up a wacky worm.
Okay.
Now, when we went out on that creek channel, no, we threw the big worm and we threw the jig, and that's all we threw. We never threw a wacky worm in there. I did throw a square bill in there and caught a couple fish on a square bill.
You threw a wacky rig around there. I was going to ask, because we saw shad everywhere we went in the creek channel today, but we never really like threw a whole ton of movement besides that square bill.
I picked up that square bill, whether it was like 3 or 4 foot outside that creek channel. I did pick up the square bill and throw that out there.
When you go to a creek bed, though, do you always think Texas rig and jig first, or is it kind of...
When the water starts getting to these temps, yeah, and that is, listen, there's a lot of guys that'll go down there, especially like the creek channel that was our best spot today. Like we said, it was 3 and 4 foot on top on the flat, but it was 7, 8 foot inside the creek channel. I was wanting to fish the deeper side of that structure and the shallow side of that structure. Well, I can't get that square bill down in that 8 foot deep creek channel, not the way I want to. But I picked that up, and that was a unique deal when I picked up the square bill, because we were sitting out beside the brush that we were fishing, and some fish kept swimming under my graph. They kept swimming, like we're in 4 foot of water, and these suckers are cruising. I'm like, Garrett, look at that one, look at that one, look at that one. And they're like, we're like hey, I reeled my worm in, because I'd let him start throwing the jig to catch the big ones, and I reeled my worm in, and without even stripping line out, I just dropped my pole, because it was only this much water, dropped it down to the bottom and caught one right under my trolling motor, dude. Like, and so when I saw that, I saw all those fish going under, so I moved the boat offside, picked up the square bill, and started catching, some numbers. They weren't the bigger fish, but started catching some. There are guys that'll take a square bill though on a creek channel with that depth, and they can cover that creek channel even faster. And a square bill will catch a big fish, no doubt about it. I mean, it's a reaction bait. When it bounces off a piece of brush or cover, it'll catch a big fish. That's one of those personal preference deals. For me, when the water starts getting cold and I want to catch big ones, I think about slowing down with that jig. It's just worked out for me over the years that I catch a lot more big fish slowing down with a jig. I think in general, a square bill will catch an active big fish, but a jig will catch an active big fish. And like that fish that sees that square bill bounce and goes and bites it, if I throw that jig down there and it hits that stump, he's going to bite that jig too. But that fish that sits there and stares at that jig for a while before he bites it, he ain't biting that square bill. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what's in my head. Like the jig will catch the active fish that'll bite the square bill and the inactive fish that won't bite the square bill. It has the potential to anyway. So I feel like I can clean out that creek channel a lot better with a jig than I can a square bill. Now, if I was on a lake that I wasn't really familiar with and I was having to cover a whole bunch of creek channel area and I was covering an area of creek channel that was 3 to 5 foot deep on the top side, then I might very well pick up a square bill just to be more efficient in how fast I covered the ground. But if I'm on a lake that I kind of know the areas they're going to be in, I'm going to want to slow down every chance I get. And if I was covering water on a new lake with a square bill, every time I got a bite, as soon as I got a bite, I'd set it down and pick up a jig.
So then would you troll, kind of like you were saying, swinging out around the creek on yourself, would you troll and throw like a chatterbait kind of as like
I would never throw a chatterbait around a stump line creek channel.
Square bill, man.
Square bill for sure would be my choice, just because the chatterbait is going to hang wood a lot. Now, if I had some grass on that creek, if I had grass in that flat around that creek channel, then a chatterbait would absolutely be in play, or a lipless crankbait. It's all going to depend on the cover. So much of what we do in this sport, and I know you guys probably get sick of hearing me say this, it's about being efficient. The more efficient you can be, the more fish you're going to catch. I mean, you look at, I'm going to tell you, there's the biggest difference between the guys that came here 2 weeks ago with the Bassmaster Elite Series and the Bass Pro Tour guys. The biggest difference between those guys and the guys that are real good on Bass Champs and stuff like that is efficiency. If you get in a boat with one, you ever lucky enough to get in a boat with some of those guys, you will notice they are like machines, Jack. Like that bait is in a strikeable position for a much higher percentage of the day than anybody else you've ever fished with. That's how those guys are. You look at how Patrick Walters won this tournament and dominated it. He used live scope to make sure his bait was in front of a fish throughout the day. Not to fish a better area, not that he was fishing a better part of the lake. It wasn't that his area had more and bigger fish in it. Wasn't the case at all. He left and went to the other side of the lake and caught them the same way. You know what I mean? The first day when he caught his first limit, he wasn't where he caught his limit the first day, his 20-something pound limit. He never fished it again the rest of the tournament. it wasn't about an area or him having better fish grouped up in an area or anything like that. It was 100% about him being more efficient with that live scope and making sure that every time he made a cast, his bait stayed in front of a fish. Right? And that's what it's all about, man. To really kind of improve, once you get the fundamentals and the basics and you become efficient with a lot of different techniques, it's about seeing what type of area you're wanting to fish that day and making a plan on that, and then using the techniques in the most efficient way possible. So if I'm around not a lot of grass and a whole lot of wood, I don't want to throw a lipless crankbait or a chatterbait. I want to throw a square bill or a spinnerbait or a weedless swim bait or something I can fish efficiently in wood. Vice versa, if I'm in grass, I don't want to fish a square bill. I want to fish a chatterbait. You know what I mean? So it really becomes about being efficient and making sure that your bait is in a strikeable position. Because when your square bill is hung up in grass and watered up, it's not strikeable. And when your chatterbait's hung on that stump, it's not strikeable. I did have one time where one pulled one off a stump, but yeah, that really did happen on camera one day I was filming. I hung a chatterbait up on a stump and I was going up to get it, and all of a sudden my chatterbait started swimming off. I'm like, oh God, I got one. He came up and pulled it off the stump. I was no doubt doing this and hung up on the stump. I started going to it, and right as I got up to it, it bit it and left the stump and took off with it. Yeah, because I was doing this the whole time because I was mad. I guess it sat there and shook enough till he came up and ate it off the stump. Literally pulled it off the stump. Pretty wild. Only time I've ever had that happen, though. I've heard about guys saying that happened. They get hung up, a fish takes it off. That's the only time I've ever seen that happen for me. But yeah, the efficiency deal is, I'm repeating it a lot, but it's real important. Yeah. It's real important.
You talked a little bit about bait awareness, like you knowing as a fisherman what your chatterbait's doing out there a little bit better than how I know what it's doing.
Is the house coming down?
About ruined Christmas over here.
The house coming down? Bait awareness.
Yeah.
Yes, and that is a term that I stole from Patrick Walters in one of his interviews. And we talked to him on the podcast last week about his performance here and all that. It is something that I've thought about often, but it's his terminology. Yeah, bait awareness might be the most important thing in bass fishing. And bait awareness translates right into efficiency. So bait awareness is knowing exactly where your bait is in the water column, feeling it when it hits a piece of brush, feeling it when it hits a stump, feeling it when it hits the bottom, and feeling it when a fish bites it, and knowing the difference. Some of those bites we got today, especially early on the chatterbait and some of the jig bites, were what we call mushy bites. You have to be very aware of your bait to know the difference between that mushy bite on that chatterbait and that grass wadding up on it. So bait awareness, the blade vibration on the chatterbait, how deep it is in the water column. Am I deep enough that I might have got bogged down in the bottom? Am I high enough where I didn't? Yes, bait awareness is that. Being aware of your bait is going to make you have your bait in a strikeable position in a higher percentage of the day, which is what it's all about.
Right, and you don't necessarily need to have live scope to have bait awareness. No. It's just like fishing.
Sure does make it easier.
It does.
When you can literally see your bait, it makes it easier.
Yeah, absolutely. But it's video game fishing.
It's crazy.
But, knowing. So a lot of times when I'm fishing a wacky worm and some brush, I'll throw it out there, pass it. I will know.
Yeah. Before you finish this guy's the best wacky worm fisherman on planet Earth, and the reason why is because he knows what he's doing.
I know that bait is approaching that brush pile. I know one more pop and I'm in the brush pile before I even get there. I just know. So that way I can be a little bit more deliberate with that pop. Maybe a little bit. Maybe I'm popping it this way, or maybe I'm popping it that way. Mm-hmm. Just a certain little thing to be aware of when your bait is down under the water. And that comes not, again, live scope, of course, it helps with everything because you can see it. But, feel. Yeah. Being able to feel that, understanding how your bait moves in the water. All of that is
bait awareness has been a huge factor in the sport of bass fishing long before live scope ever existed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I said you're the best wacky worm fisherman on earth. That might not be true. You're the best one that I've ever known, though. hands down, the best wacky worm fisherman that I've ever known. And that's exactly right. It's because you know exactly what that worm is doing, when it's doing it, and why it's doing it. You know why you need to move it this way or that way, or let it fall another 2 seconds, or okay, it's already on the bottom, I can go ahead and twist it again. I've been in the boat with him a ton because it's all he wants to fish, a wacky worm. So every time I've been in the boat with him, he's been fishing a wacky worm. I guarantee you. At some point in the day, every time we fish, I don't think we've ever had a day where you didn't pick one up.
probably have one tied on tomorrow too.
I know you will. It's going to be like, Fish Life community package says throw a square bill. Wacky worm. Got it. Let's go. By square bill, you mean like a shad-colored wacky worm? Is that what you're talking about?
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
The chartreuse.
Yeah.
So with wacky, like like you're fishing. Let's say you're fishing 10 foot. You throw it out there. You know that okay in your head. Maybe you're not actually counting, but in your head you've counted 5 seconds, and that bait is.
He's got the feel for what depth it is.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely. And that also depends on what size weight you're going to use on the wacky worm. I never throw a wacky worm weightless. I always get a nail weight and either cut it in half for 10 feet of water and less and shove it in the head, or if I'm fishing deeper than 10 feet, I use the whole nail weight. Or if it's real windy, I use the whole nail weight. But you get to a point where
Fish it enough, you know the feel.
You know by feel, by watching your line fall, because I mean, you throw a jig out there, okay, you see your line coming through the water quick, and then boom, and then you see a big slack in your line. Well, you see the same thing with the wacky worm if you know how to.
It's more subtle, but it's there.
How to hold your pole on the descent. What to look for in your line, everything. So.
Yep, absolutely. Another bait that's so important with it is another bait that's really good this time of year is an Alabama rig. Especially as these fish continue to condense and progress back out of these creeks. Man, these little pinch point bridges and all these creek arms will become a player out here. They always do every year this time of year. And an Alabama rig's real important to know what depth you got it in. You got to know your sink rate. And one thing else you got to familiarize with yourself with is your rise rate on an Alabama rig. That's something I've never heard anybody talk about that to me is the most important part of Alabama rig fishing is you got to know by the speed you're turning that Alabama rig, is it staying level, is it dropping, or is it rising? Because when those fish start condensing around those bridge ponds, they ain't always going to be right on the bottom. When they're on the bottom, it's great. You throw the Alabama rig out there, you let go of the bottom, and you just point your rod down and you just crawl it. And every once in a while you pause it, make sure you're not too far off the bottom, and you keep crawling it. Keep it around the bottom. That's easy. We don't do that. But a lot of times those fish are going to be somewhere on those bridge pilings or on those aprons. They're out off them and they're suspending off them. And if you don't bring that Alabama rig through them for a pretty good percentage of your cast, you're not going to catch them. You're not. Guess where a fish's eyes are? Top of his head. So if you're under them, forget it, Jack. And if you're over them by too much when the water's cold, they're not coming to get it. Like you got to get it pretty close to them to get their attention when the water's cold. So bait awareness is probably the most important. I mean, how many of these tournaments do you see where one guy's leading it on a jerk bait, another guy's catching them on a jig, and another guy's catching them on a crankbait? And like Keith Combs got second in that tournament, he was throwing a 6XD. He wasn't doing anything like anybody else was doing. But you know what Keith Combs was? He was very aware of that 6XD every time it was touching something on bottom, and how deep it was exactly, and was he hitting bottom? If he wasn't, he needed to get a little higher on the point. You know what I mean? Like he was very aware of that bait. So bait awareness is a big deal. Yeah. Any other questions on the jig? I didn't talk about rod, reel, and line setup. I mean, I like a pretty big rod on a jig, but I like a light, sensitive one. My favorite jig rod is a 7.7 heavy Century Series rod by 6 cents. It's a more expensive rod. On a jig, to me, it's important to go ahead, if you can. Can you fish a jig on a $100 rod? Sure you can. I've done it for years. It's better to fish it on a more expensive rod with a better, more sensitive, lightweight blank. That Century Series is about as light and sensitive as any rod I've ever put in my hands, so I really like that. The mid 7-foot heavy range seems to be the deal for me. I've fished as short as 7.4. I've fished as big as 7.8, but that 7.5 foot range, heavy action, lightweight, high quality blank, that's going to be a good jig rod. You need that big rod because of what you're throwing that jig in and the size fish you're catching on a jig. Like you hook a 7-pounder in a brush pile, when you set the hook, you want there to be a little bit of upward momentum right away. Like even on a 7-pounder, like, you set the hook on a 10-pounder, it's going to lock up. You're not going to pull that fish. But a lot of these fish, when you set the hook, if you've ever noticed on these good, especially on these good rods, you'll set the hook and your rod will bow all the way up and it kind of unfolds a little bit. Have y'all noticed that? That's that rod jerking that fish straight up. And that's what you want when you set the hook on a jig fish in a brush pile or a creek bend around stumps and root systems. You want to set that hook straight up to your right shoulder, and you want that rod to immediately start pulling that fish up to get him out of that brush. Because you can get your heart broke tangling one up in that junk, you know what I mean? And you are going to sometimes, if you're fishing heavy brush piles or heavy cover on creek channel edges, you are going to lose some fish when they tie you up in the junk. It's going to happen. One thing you can do is if you feel it hang up on that brush, never let your rod unfold and get straight, but quit pulling as hard. Like still keep tension on it, but let up a little bit. Let that rod, like if that rod's bowed like this, let it go to here, and because that fish wants to get away from that stump or that brush. He wants away from it. And if you'll do that, he'll go ahead and bow your rod up the rest of the way and swim away. And then once he swims away a little bit, you pull him back up. And if he hangs in it again, rinse and repeat until next time you pull and now he comes out. I've had so many fish lock me up in brush. I did it today. Fish lock me up in brush, and I'll kind of ease up and just let that rod unfold a little bit, but never get straight. And that fish will pull and get away from that brush, and then I re-pull him, and he comes through, and I got him. That's one thing I see a lot of people make a mistake when they hit a fish in heavy cover and he gets hung on wood or anything heavy. They just pull and try to hold him to it. Well, if you do that, that jig is pent up against that stump, and that fish is sitting there on the end of that jig going as hard as he can. He's going to rip that jig out. If that jig's in a fixed position and he got all the leverage to rip, he's going to knock that jig out. You know what I'm saying? It's like if you were trying to get that jig out of his mouth and you were doing this, or if you were grabbing the line and doing it. Like, you know what I mean? Like you're going to grab the line and do it, it's not coming out. But if you put direct tension on that jig and pop it, it comes out. You know, so you got to be careful of that. Don't pull too hard when they get locked up. 20-pound fluorocarbon's the line I always fish a jig on. Any other questions?
Any particular speed of reel?
The highest you can't get too high, because the deal with the jig is I'm never well, unless it's a swim jig, but on this deal I'm never moving that jig with my reel handle. I'm never presenting that bait with my reel handle. All I use that reel handle for is to pick up slack and reel in the fish. So I'm always moving the jig with my rod. So that means like I'll point my rod down, reel up my slack, get my line tight, and I'll move the jig with my rod handle. And all I'm doing, as far as action, the beautiful thing about fishing heavy cover around the creek channel with a jig, you don't have to impart any action on it. That jig crawling through that cover puts the action on it. So that jig eases up to that deal, catches a little bit, and then you pop it over and it falls down, right? So that's the action on the jig. And that's another reaction bite you can get when it stops and it goes, man, I had one today, hit it. As soon as it popped over and started falling, boom, they hit it. They knock slack in it. A lot of times when they do that, that's your best jig bites. That's your hardest bites. They just, when it pops over that branch or that root or whatever, when they hit it like that, it's fun. They knock the fire out of it. But you don't have to impart any action. So I'm just dragging that jig through this cover and letting the cover impart the action on the bait. And then I'll pull my rod down and reel up my slack. And I just drag, pull my rod down and reel up my slack. So I don't need to slow myself down winding it. So I like a 7.5 to 1 at least, an 8 to 1, something like that. That way when I hit that jig and that brush and that heavy cover, and I hit him with it and I start doing this, he's coming to me and getting out of that junk as fast as possible. And Lord forbid he takes a turn and runs at you, you can try to keep up. I lean more on high-speed reels, and that's why. Because even on moving baits where I need to slow down, I can, if I'm mentally focused enough, I can force myself to slow my reel handle down to a crawl. But when that fish runs at me, I can only turn my hand so fast. And so I really tend to lean to fishing more 7.5 to 1, 8 to 1, 7 to 1, higher speed, ratio reels, just because I can slow it down, but I can only speed it up so much. And there's times when that fish turns and runs at you, you need to pick up some line real quick. So that's why I do it like that. I probably fish more high speed reels than most people do on different techniques. Any other questions?
When you're fishing your wacky rig, what's your equipment?
6'10" to 7'2" medium fast action rod, 7-1 reel, 12 to 15 pound fluorocarbon. That's the rod and reel line setup.
Which line size do you use most of, 12 or 15?
15 in East Texas, just because there's.
I would say if you're new to casting a wacky worm, like me, for me with guide customers, I rig up 12-pound line more on my wacky rod, because on a bait casting setup, yeah, it's a medium rod, it's got a little whip to it, and that's good. But on a bait casting setup, 15-pound line for people that aren't used to throwing a wacky worm on a bait caster can be a little bit more challenging for them to throw it without getting some overruns. Yeah. But so I use 12-pound line more. But for guys like you that have thrown it your whole life and real familiar with it, and me personally, when I'm out fishing by myself, I'm gonna rig it up on 15-pound as well. Yeah.
I use the Lunker City nail weights, and 99.9% of the time I'm cutting them in half. Very rarely do I fish a wacky worm deeper than 10 feet. I have fished it in 17, 18 foot of water before.
Unless he's in my boat and I'm fishing out deep and he's like, well, I'm going to throw a wacky worm anyway.
Yeah.
You use 11/6 to 4th, right?
Yeah, the smallest one they make. And
Yeah, the little thin one.
Yeah, that's right. And then on the hook, the Gamakatsu #1 finesse. I think it's called the
Finesse wide gap weedless. That's it.
Yeah,
We did that pretty well.
yeah, that's pretty good.
Not bad. We're gonna sing a song
Together
later.
again.
We're gonna go make another music video later.
Hey, Nighthawk, I'm ready, baby.
Let's go, Dragon. Let's go. Told you that.
He said, no joke, he sang that whole song today. No more than 30 seconds.
No. I sang the I like big guts one. You know, I like big guts and I cannot lie. And I sang it talking about throwing a jig and a brush, and I caught like the one that was the same size, like the tie for biggest. Like a minute after I stopped singing that song, I caught a big fat bellied, tall as she was, long jig fish.
Nice.
This fish, no joke, had stretch marks on it.
It did, literally.
Wow.
I caught one today that was, man, they're feeding. I caught one today that was so fat it literally had stretch marks on its belly.
That's awesome.
Like its scales were pulling apart. Yeah. That's rare to see them that fat this time of year, but boy, they were thick. I caught one today that I don't think was a legal keeper on a state regulation lake. Like it was, well, I don't think it was 14 inches. I didn't measure it. I don't think it was, and I bet it almost weighed 3 pounds. Like it weighed 2.5, 2 3/4 pounds. No joke. Yeah. As tall as she was long, buddy. Yep. All right, any other questions? I see we had one late arrival. Sorry we didn't get most of it to you, brother.
I was watching you on YouTube over there. I was walking over here to come here and look, and I heard you upstairs. I was like,
Yeah. Voice sounds familiar.
I thought you were on Thursday night.
Yeah. Well, we do live streams on Thursday night from the garage. We do these every 2 weeks on Fridays. So if you're ever back, you from around here?
I'm from Arlington.
Arlington? Well, if you're ever back out here, we do these every 2 weeks on Friday nights. We do them, start them at 6. Appreciate you coming up here anyway. All right, hey man, if y'all haven't eaten, they got the prime rib special next door at the restaurant. Go downstairs, buy you some half-ounce jigs. They don't have 6 cents ones in here, but they got Santone, and Santone makes a fine jig too. I'm trying to be less. I know I'm always pro staffing. I do, and these guys will legitimately tell you that we're in my boat today. I talk about all the 6 cent stuff, but that's what I use. Like I don't use other stuff. And it's not that Santone doesn't make a great jig, but 6 cents makes a great jig that's as good or better than anything. And you know, if I can use my sponsors baits and it's not putting me at a disadvantage, I'm gonna use them. You know what I mean? Now there are a few things that I buy that aren't 6 cents or Smash Tech, but most of the stuff they make, they do a pretty good job of making the best in the category, or as good anyway. So, hey, thank y'all so much for joining us, and I will see you on 2 weeks.